everything that is said is potentially used against you, and so anything which is difficult, anything which the president won't like, I think has to be done face to face.
But firstly, Sarah, if you're finding global affairs a bit overwhelming right now, you're not alone, because this week has seen Donald Trump throw a diplomatic grenade into Western solidarity and support for Ukraine, taking on a war of words against his opposite number, Volodymyr Zelensky. Today, too, we're closely watching events in Gaza as Israel accuses Hamas of breaking the hostage return agreement. So it's a difficult diplomatic week ahead as Keir Starmer heads to the White House to meet President Trump, and reports emerge that Moscow is hoping to claim victory over NATO in Ukraine on Monday. To try and make some sense of all of this, I'm joined now by Lord McDonald, Simon MacDonald, former Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office. Good afternoon, Lord MacDonald.
Good afternoon, Cathy.
Well, it's a kind of monster week of diplomacy, isn't it, next week? Emmanuel Macron visiting DC on Monday, Keir Starmer later in the week. Clearly, the rules of diplomacy, the normal rules, don't apply to Donald Trump. So what would your advice be to Keir Starmer as he heads over there?
He's got to prepare carefully. I think there will be quite a sharp difference between what he says in public and what he says in private. In public, this relationship between the UK and the US has to be acknowledged again as the single most important diplomatic relationship for our country. But in private, I think he needs to marshal his facts and have a very difficult conversation with the president, because the president clearly has got the wrong end of the stick about very important detail in Ukraine and our options in dealing with Ukraine. Right now, today, Donald Trump has said that Ukraine has no cards. He is portraying Ukraine as almost a bystander in its own war, which is completely wrong. Although the United States is providing a lot of help to Ukraine, the single most important supplier is Ukraine itself. So the Ukrainians are the key actor here. The Ukrainians do not need to accept somebody else's instruction because this is a matter of life and death for them, and they can keep going even if the president of the United States doesn't like that.
But I mean, you talk about Donald Trump having the wrong end of the stick there. It looks very much from the outside that he's kind of governing according to personal grudge. And in that context, given the stuff he's been putting out on social media that seems to bear no relation to the facts, does Keir Starmer, preparing carefully and in his legalistic way, smattering the facts in his conversation, does that make any difference? I mean, it's not going to work, is it?
You are right about Trump's approach. And one of the factors in the poor relationship between President Trump and President Zelensky is President Zelensky's role in the first impeachment of Donald Trump. You remember Trump is the only president in U.S. history to be impeached twice. The second was after the 6th of January riots. The first was after he tried to pressure the president of Ukraine into opening an investigation into Hunter Biden. And the pressure he exerted was by withholding a package of assistance and a visit to the White House. This became public. Congress didn't like it. The House of Representatives impeached him. We know from repeated examples that the president has a thin skin and doesn't forget. So Zelensky is suffering the consequences of that.
But my point is that there's very little that Keir Starmer can do about that. I mean, he can talk facts and try and make a coherent argument, but Donald Trump isn't going to listen, is he?
This is why I'm making the distinction between public and private. In public, everything that is said is potentially used against you, and so anything which is difficult, Anything which the president won't like, I think, has to be done face to face. And our prime minister has that opportunity last week. Now, I do not know if it will work, but I know a public slanging match will not. I know that the president is getting key things wrong and needs to be corrected in some way. It seems to me the best chance is Keir Starmer, who has already met Donald Trump, building on that relationship in private, politely, clearly, with evidence, explaining what is going on the ground.
Right. Okay, well, let's see if that gets anywhere. But in the meantime, do you look at Europe, and, Europe is in some disarray, but if you're sitting in Downing Street now, wouldn't you think, actually, you've probably got a fairer chance of achieving some kind of national self-interest by cozying up to Europe than you have getting close to a very unpredictable White House?
I repeat, the United States is our single most important diplomatic relationship, and the occupant of the White House doesn't change that fact. Second point, the Europe
single,
at the moment,
though, the emphasis on the word single, though, because, I mean, if you're the EU collectively, you could throw in your lot with them over, prioritise that over the White House, couldn't you?
Well, if we wish to reapply, then looking at Europe collectively, yes, that would come back on the table. But at the moment, we're dealing with the European partners individually. And so all of them rank behind the United States. I would also say, Kathy, that you look at Europe right now, and most of the big European players are in some domestic political turmoil.
Yeah.
So the Germans have an election on Sunday. It is likely that an extreme right-wing party will be the second largest in the Bundestag. Meanwhile, in Paris, President Macron is suffering the consequences of an unnecessary election to the Assemblée Nationale last year. So the biggest European players are in some disorder.
Well, this is all extremely depressing, and I know it's not your job to be an optimist, but can you see any sort of hope on the horizon that we'll look back on this moment as the beginning of this incredible peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, that they'll all lay their weapons down and it will be a lasting peace?
I mean, one other characteristic of Donald Trump is to challenge in a way that feels outrageous to those being challenged. And that is happening right now to Europe over Ukraine policy. Part of the reaction, and it's still early days, is Europe looking again at what it is doing for Ukraine. And what I note is that across Europe, there is a recognition that Europe needs to do more. So it is true that the United States is the biggest single supplier to Ukraine, but Europe already does almost as much as the United States, and could do even more than that. So this might be the moment that Europe took its own security, including the security of the east of its continent, more seriously.
Right, well, there's a glimmer of hope there, I suppose. Just briefly before we finish, I'm afraid, again, back to some very dismal news, the other story we've been covering today, which is Gaza and that ceasefire really hanging in the balance. If you're looking at it now, if you were in the Foreign Office right now, would you expect that ceasefire to hold because of the self-interest of all of the parties involved, or not?
I hope so. I think people will be working very hard. I note that this is not the first time that the ceasefire has come under huge pressure. But as you say, it is the interests of all parties to keep it going with external help, as with the previous crisis. I hope that will happen again.